I recently discovered a note my fiance, 34 million, wrote about me, 35 female. We've been together for 4.5 years, and we're planning to get married by March 2025. Please advise how you have dealt with such situation. The note included. He texted it 2 weeks ago. I couldn't sleep that night, and as his phone lay on the bedside table, I picked it up automatically. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a habit brought on perhaps by the distrust that had gradually crept into our relationship over the last few months. I pressed the screen, and it opened without a password. At that moment, I didn't realize that that simple movement would be followed by the destruction of everything I thought we had in common. The moonlight fell softly on his face as I sat beside him, reading every line of the note he'd written. My heart quickened with each phrase. It wasn't just a letter. It was a cold analysis of our life, which I had always thought was solid and sincere. He spoke of the boredom that gripped him, of the routine we had fallen into. Sometimes it's boring with her, were words that stabbed like a knife into my heart. I didn't know how long he'd been carrying these thoughts around. When had things gotten boring for him? Did he no longer enjoy our evenings together, our plans for the future? We sat at the same table, shared meals, laughed, but it was all a lie. I looked at his sleeping face and wondered if he was really with me in those moments, or if his thoughts were already wandering somewhere far away. We had known each other for a few years now, and I thought we had reached that stage where relationships become stable, not boring. We had our own dreams, plans for the future, and I believed we were moving toward them. But there was no passion in his words, only a desire for stability, a quiet but bleak stability with no room for love, only for convenience. I caught myself thinking that his every word was eating away at my confidence. I used to think our love could survive any hardship. We'd been through so much together, the long late-night conversations, the moments when we laughed until we cried, and those rare but important moments when the silence between us was filled with comfort instead of tension. But now, I could see that perhaps he had been somewhere far away all this time, mentally distant, though physically near. And even now, sitting in the dark, I remembered our conversations about the future. He'd said he wanted children, that he dreamed of family travel, stability. But what was behind those words? Was it more than a desire to live a calm, orderly life in which emotions were minimized? To him, marriage was a way of simplification, not of bringing two people together, but merely a convenient construct to accomplish goals. Love no longer played an important role, it seemed to me at the time. He continued to sleep, not even realizing how his world had begun to crumble before my eyes. I remembered the first time we'd met. It had been almost accidental mutual friends, a random night at a cafe. I never thought this stranger could turn my life upside down. I remember our first kiss. It wasn't the most passionate, but there was so much sincerity, so much tenderness in it. He was the one who always supported me, who made me stronger, even when I doubted myself. And now those feelings were starting to blur. There was no love in his words, and that was the most painful part. She's boring, he said, as if I were some kind of barrier to his ideal life. But when does boredom replace love? Did it happen suddenly or gradually? I couldn't find an answer. My thoughts raced like a maze, each turn leading to new questions. When had he started doubting us? Maybe there were moments I'd missed. Somewhere I hadn't noticed that his smiles had become strained and his gazes aloof. Or perhaps it had always been there, but I didn't want to see. Now I felt the weight of those doubts, as if someone had placed a weight on my shoulders that was unbearable to live with. I remembered the moment at a friend's wedding that he had mentioned in the note. I was sure that evening had gone well. We danced, we laughed, we took pictures with the other guests. But now I wondered, was he really happy that night? Or had he even then begun to think of our relationship as something that no longer brought him joy? Perhaps he saw every moment we shared as a chore, an obligation to be fulfilled. There was also something else in his note that hurt me deeply. She's more of a convenience now. Those words may have been the cruelest of all. Convenience. As if I wasn't a person with a soul, feelings and dreams, but just a tool to achieve his quiet, measured life. There was no love in it, only calculation, and realizing that hurt me. When I closed his phone and set it back on the nightstand, everything inside me crumbled. The world I'd spent years building was as fragile as a house of cards. I stood up and walked out of the room without saying a word. My feet automatically carried me, not realizing where I was going. His words echoed in my head, and the painful realization that maybe we'd already lost each other pounded in my heart. In that moment, standing in the kitchen with a cup of iced tea in my hands, I realized we had everything, every opportunity to make our relationship great. But somewhere along the way, we had missed something important. We had lost the connection, the very magic that holds people together despite all the difficulties and disappointments. The next morning, I decided to talk to him. My voice was calm but cold as ice. I didn't know how he'd react, but what I'd learned was too significant to simply forget. When he woke up, his face was serene, as if nothing had happened. He had no idea that I had learned the whole truth that night. I asked him directly about the note. His reaction was the expected one, anger. He didn't make excuses, didn't apologize for his words. Instead, he accused me of violating his privacy, of reading the note without permission. I tried to explain to him how deeply those words hurt me, but he only made it worse. His pride wouldn't let him admit that those lines were cruel and destructive. He didn't want to discuss what he had written. He only wanted to blame me. My voice shook, but I told him I was leaving. Pain appeared on his face, but it was the pain of a proud man who couldn't admit his guilt. I packed my things in silence. We didn't utter another word to each other. As I closed the door behind me, my heart was filled with conflicting feelings. I loved him, but I couldn't stay with a man who saw me as a convenience rather than an equal partner. Maybe I'd made a mistake by leaving so suddenly, without trying to explain myself, but I felt like it was too late to make a change. It had been a few days since we'd broken up, and I couldn't find a place to go. There were thousands of thoughts running through my head, but none of them answered my questions. I tried to distract myself. I walked in parks, watched TV series, met with friends, but his words did not leave me alone. In the evenings, I sat in the kitchen hugging a cup of tea and pondered what went wrong. Where was that moment when we started to drift apart? Why hadn't I noticed it sooner? His phrase, "she's boring," kept echoing in my mind. I wondered how we could have gotten to this point. Our relationship hadn't always been like this. I remembered our first dates, how he told me stories of his dreams and ambitions. There was a fire in his eyes back then, and every conversation we had was filled with meaning and emotion. I believed that we were more than just a couple, that there was a deep connection between us. But now, looking back, I could see how slowly but surely that bond was beginning to break down. Maybe I was too busy working. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to him. These thoughts plagued me day after day. An inner voice whispered that I was responsible for the breakup too. But did that justify its cold, calculating words? I decided to meet our mutual friend Maria. She had known us both since the beginning of our relationship and was often there for us at the most important moments. We met in a small cafe in the city center. It took me a long time to decide to tell her everything that had happened, but finally, I told her the whole truth. Maria listened attentively, not interrupting. Her face was tense, and her eyes looked at me with sympathy. "You did the right thing to leave," she finally said. "If he already thinks of you as a convenience, that was the end of it. You can't build anything with that attitude." But even her words couldn't bring me relief. I still had my doubts. I still loved him. "But how did I not notice it before?" I asked. "He always seemed so honest, so open. When did it change?" Maria thought for a moment, then sighed. "Sometimes change happens slowly, almost imperceptibly. You're both busy with your lives, your affairs, and at some point you stop noticing each other. But the real problem isn't that you didn't notice. The real problem is that he didn't want to make a change. He wrote that note, but he didn't talk to you, didn't try to work out his feelings or your relationship." Her words were like ice water burning the mind. She was right. He didn't try. All this time he'd been silent, hoarding his doubts inside instead of sharing them with me. Maybe if he had told me that he was getting bored, that he was feeling dissatisfied, we could have fixed it. We could have fought for our relationship. But instead he chose the path of silence and then made a record, as if drawing a line under our years together. I spent several days thinking about Maria's words. Gradually, the pain of betrayal and misunderstanding began to be replaced by a strange sense of emptiness. I looked at our life together, at the moments when we could have talked about everything, but instead remained silent. I remembered our trips when we sat together in the car, but instead of talking about the future, we just listened to the radio, each of us in our own thoughts. Over time, I realized that it wasn't just his decision. We had both fallen into a routine, letting boredom and monotony take over our relationship. Yes, his words were cruel, but perhaps they reflected his fear that our feelings had faded. He couldn't say it outright, and that was his mistake, but neither could I see that he was growing distant. I started digging into my memories of us. I remembered how he'd often suggested we go out, take a trip, but I'd refused, citing busyness. I was working late, I had projects, clients, things to do. I always found an excuse. Maybe he felt forgotten, and then one day he got bored and withdrew. Maybe there's more pain in his note than I saw at first glance. A few weeks passed. I tried to move on with my life, but the feeling of emptiness didn't go away. Every single thing in the house reminded me of him. His favorite cup was on the shelf. His jacket still hung in the hallway. Even the smell of his cologne was a reminder of our loss. But what tormented me the most were the memories of the plans we'd made. I couldn't stop thinking about how we could have been happy if we both wanted to be. I often found myself wanting to call him to see how he was doing. Would he want to talk? Would he try to get me back? These were the questions that plagued me, But I knew that if he called, I wouldn't be sure of my answer. One evening, I sat on the balcony, enjoying the cool of the night. I looked up at the stars and pondered our future, which was no longer there. Why didn't we fight for it? Why did we let our love become something ordinary? In that moment, the thought occurred to me that maybe it wasn't over yet. We were both guilty, but what if this wasn't the end, but just a new beginning? I remembered his note again. I want stability and want to focus on the more important things in life. What if stability wasn't a bad thing? What if he just wanted certainty about the future like I did? We both talked about kids, about traveling, about the future, but we didn't take steps toward creating it. Maybe there was more to his words, not indifference, but a desire for something more. The next morning, I decided to talk to him, not to blame or reproach him. I wanted to see if there was anything left to salvage. Maybe he was in as much pain as I was. I dialed his number, and my heart beat faster. My fingers trembled, but there was a strange calm inside me. No matter what happened, I needed answers. It took forever, but finally he answered. "Hi!" His voice was hoarse, sleepy, as if I'd woken him up. I sighed, trying to contain my excitement, and started to speak. "We need to talk." My voice sounded firm, but I felt a slight tremor. This was the moment when I could either close the door to our relationship forever or leave it ajar for something new. He was silent for a few seconds, and then answered quietly, "Yes, I think you're right." His tone was not the usual coldness, but rather tiredness, as if he too had been out of sorts the last few days. The tone seemed familiar to me. Maybe he, like me, was thinking about us, about what had happened. We agreed to meet on neutral territory, in the same cafe where we had once sat with friends and shared our first impressions of each other. This was the place where everything started, and now it seemed symbolic for me to complete the circle here. I arrived early and sat by the window. I ordered a cup of tea, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My mind was jumbled, but one thing was clear. I had to be honest. No recriminations, no accusations, just to say what was inside. He came in 15 minutes later. When he entered the cafe, I saw his gaze linger on me for a moment, and there was sadness in his eyes. He sat down across from me, and tension hung between us in the silence. We were silent for a few minutes, not knowing where to begin. Finally, I sighed and spoke. "I don't want to blame you or discuss what was wrong. I just want to understand why it happened." He looked at me, his gaze serious. "I don't know myself," he began. "When I wrote that note, I was thinking about how things should be different. I felt like we were stuck, like everything had become the same, day in and day out. We stopped talking about the things we cared about, stopped laughing like we used to." He paused as if searching for the right words. "I was bored, but not because of you personally. I felt like we were losing something important, and I didn't know how to fix it." His confession was a revelation to me. He didn't try to justify himself, didn't put the blame on me. Instead, he shared his fears, his confusion, and suddenly I realized that was exactly what I'd been missing in our last few conversations. Honesty. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked quietly. "Why didn't you say anything?" He lowered his eyes and shook his head. "I thought I could figure it out on my own. I didn't want to worry you. I saw that you were busy, you had your own life, your own things to do, and I was afraid that if I started talking, it would ruin everything." I caught a familiar feeling in his words. I was like him myself. We had both avoided talking about our problems, thinking it would save us from pain, from confrontation. But now it was clear that this silence was what had destroyed us. "It wasn't easy for me either," I admitted, feeling tears come to my eyes. "I didn't know how to cope either. You were there for me, but I didn't feel that closeness we used to have. And instead of talking, I was just distant, finding excuses. I thought that work was more important, that these were temporary difficulties that we would get over." We were both silent, digesting what we'd said. There was no longer the impenetrable wall between us that had been there for the past few months. It turned out that we were both afraid of the same thing, afraid of losing each other, but because of that fear, we were drifting further apart. "Do you ever regret us being together?" I asked, not taking my eyes off his face. It was a question that had plagued me ever since I'd read his note. He looked at me and without thinking replied, "No, never. I love you, always have." His voice was firm and sincere, and for the first time in a long time I felt like they weren't just words. They came from the heart. "Then why did you write those things?" I needed to understand it all the way through. "I didn't write because I had fallen out of love with you," he said, sighing. "I was desperate. I didn't know how to make things right. I felt like I was stuck in a life that didn't bring me joy. I wrote this more for myself to try to understand my feelings, but instead of talking to you, I just hid behind these thoughts." His words were a painful reminder of how often people in relationships start to drift apart, hiding behind their own fears and resentments. We both realized that we had been on this path for too long, ignoring the signs that something was going wrong. We sat in the cafe for hours, trying to piece together our feelings. Each question, each answer brought us closer to the realization that our problems were not insurmountable. We just let them accumulate. Finally, as we talked, I felt my heart feel lighter. I looked at him and asked, "What should we do next?" He looked at me, holding my gaze for a second as if he were weighing his options. His face was a mixture of tiredness and hope. We were sitting in this cafe like we were in a time loop, the place where everything had begun, where our relationship could either continue or end. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that I don't want it to end this way. I want us to give ourselves another chance. I want us to try to fix things, but I also realize that we're going to have to change a lot of things, and it's not going to be easy." His words echoed in my heart. I didn't want it to end either. Despite all the hurt, all the pain that had built up over the past few months, I still loved him. I could see how hard this confession was for him, how hard he was trying to be honest, and it gave me back the feeling that we could overcome this crisis if we both wanted to. "But how do we do that?" I smiled weakly. "We've both made mistakes. We've kept quiet and avoided problems for so long. I don't want to be in the same situation again in a year." He leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in a long time. "I think we need to start by learning how to talk to each other. Not just talk about household issues or weekend plans, but talk about how we feel, what's bothering us. I wasn't bored because you've changed or our relationship has gotten worse." He was silent for a moment, as if trying to find the right words, and then he said quietly, "I don't know. I want us to try to make things right, but it won't be easy." Those words didn't give me a definitive answer, but there was something important in them. He wasn't giving up on us. He cared, and maybe this was our chance. I looked at him, trying to see if he was sincere in his desire to make things right. "Do you really think we can do this?" I asked, feeling hope and fear struggling inside me. He nodded, but his gaze remained serious. "I think if we both want it, if we're honest with each other, we have a chance. But we can't just go back to the way things were. We need to build something new." His words were frightening and inspiring at the same time. It was impossible to go back to the way things were, but I wasn't ready to just give up. Something inside me told me that maybe all these difficulties were a chance for us to grow stronger. "I want to try too," I said, realizing that despite all the pain, I was still willing to fight for us. We both knew it wasn't going to be easy. We had made a lot of mistakes, and it took time to heal old wounds. But for the first time in a long time, there was understanding between us again. We no longer hid behind hurt feelings in silence. We began to talk, openly and honestly. "Let's start with small steps," I suggested. "Let's try to learn how to be together again, without expectations or pressure." He agreed, and at that moment I felt some invisible wall between us begin to crumble. We didn't know what would happen next, but most importantly, we were ready to work on it. The next day, we agreed to meet after work. I felt light and cautiously hopeful. Maybe we could really make a new start. We decided to go to the park where we used to walk a lot. It used to be our favorite place, where we laughed, talked about everything, and didn't think about the future, just enjoyed the moment. Now it was like trying to regain something forgotten, something we had lost along the way. As we walked down the tree-lined alley, I felt the space fill with something new. We walked side by side, talking about little things, about work, about plans for the week. These conversations were simple, but they felt warm. I caught his gaze, and it felt like we were getting to know each other again, like we were building our world anew. At one point, he stopped and turned to me. "You know, I was thinking that one of the reasons I was bored was because I stopped appreciating you. I used to take everything for granted and then wonder why I felt that way." His confession caught me off guard, but I couldn't help but appreciate the honesty.